The morning light hit the windows of Hartwell and Cole the way it always did in late October, sideways, gold, unforgiving. Tanner Wilds stood at the glass wall of his corner office on the 38th floor and watched the street below fill with people who had somewhere to be. He had somewhere to be, too. He just hadn't moved yet. His assistant had laid the mail on his desk 20 minutes ago. Most of it he hadn't touched, but one envelope, cream-colored, heavier than it needed to be, sat off to the side like it knew he was avoiding it. He picked it up. Mr. Tanner Wilds and guest are cordially invited to celebrate the union of Margot Ellison and Clifford Beaumont at the Meridian Club Saturday, November 9th, at 7 in the evening. He set it down. Margot Ellison. He said the name quietly, just to hear how it landed now, 3 years later. It landed the same way it always did, like stepping on a stair that wasn't there. She had been a music teacher at the public school 2 blocks from his old apartment, the one he lived in before Hartwell and Cole became what it was, before his name appeared on the side of a building. She taught third graders how to play Twinkle on a recorder, and stayed late to grade sight reading tests and smelled faintly of rosin and chalk. She was exactly the kind of woman he had never expected to fall for, and then couldn't imagine living without. When the firm's growth demanded more of him, longer hours, more travel, a persona that fit the conference rooms and donor dinners, Margot had tried. He knew she had, but he also knew, if he was honest, that he had stopped trying before she did. And when she finally said what they'd both been circling for months, he had not argued. He had stood there in the kitchen of that apartment, coffee going cold on the counter, and let her go. She was marrying Clifford Beaumont. He knew the name. Everyone in the city did. Old money, charming at parties, the kind of man who wore a signet ring unironically and got photographed at fundraisers. Exactly the kind of man who fit into the life Tanner had built without her. He looked at the invitation one more time. Then he looked at the skyline. He didn't know why he said yes. The Meridian Club sat on the west side of the park, its limestone facade lit warm and golden against the November dark. Tanner arrived alone, which he understood immediately was a mistake. Not because of what people would say, because of what Margot would see. He checked his coat at the door and stood for a moment in the marble entry hall, listening to the string quartet and the clink of crystal and the low hum of 200 people who all seemed to belong here. He smoothed his jacket. He reminded himself he had closed a 9-figure deal last spring without blinking. Then he nearly walked directly into someone. "Sorry," he started. She stepped back quickly, steadied herself on the edge of a side table. She was smaller than he'd registered at first, dressed in a deep burgundy that caught the chandelier light. Her dark hair was pulled back simply. Her eyes, when they met his, were brown and wide and startled. He recognized her faintly, the way you recognize someone you've seen in passing, filed away without meaning to. "You play piano," he said, "at the coffee lounge in the Kessler building." She blinked. "I do. I did." A pause. "I still do. Part-time." He waited. Something shifted in her expression then. A decision made quickly, in the way people make decisions when they have no good options left and the clock is running. Her hands pressed together in front of her, and her voice dropped. "I know this is an impossible thing to ask a stranger," she said, "but I need someone to walk in there with me, and I need him to believe it's real." Tanner looked at her for a long moment. "Him," he said. She nodded toward the ballroom doors. "The groom's brother. We were together for 2 years. He's in there with someone new and I—" She stopped, exhaled. "I'm sorry. This is insane. Forget I said anything." She started to turn. "What's your name?" Tanner said. She looked back. Fiona Grady." He offered his arm. "I'm Tanner Wilds," he said. "And for the record, you're not the only one here who needed a reason to walk through that door." Fiona Grady, he learned quickly, was a former concert pianist who had stopped performing 3 years ago after a nerve injury in her right hand, a condition called focal dystonia, which she explained quietly between introductions as though it were a minor inconvenience and not the thing that had taken her entire identity in one long, silent unraveling. She now played background music at corporate lounges and gave private lessons on weekends. She lived alone in a 1-bedroom in the Garfield district. She had come to this wedding because her invitation had arrived, and she had told herself she was over it, and she had been wrong. He learned all of this in the first 20 minutes, in the fragments she offered between the public performance of their evening, and he found himself listening in a way he hadn't listened to anyone in a long time. The groom's brother was a man named Porter Bellamy, tall, easy smile, the kind of man who laughed too loudly at his own jokes. Tanner spotted the moment Fiona saw him. Her grip tightened almost imperceptibly on his arm. Her chin went up. Porter noticed them from across the room and made his way over with the ease of someone who had never once questioned whether he belonged anywhere. "Fiona," he said. "Didn't think you'd come." His eyes moved to Tanner. "Didn't think you'd come with company." Tanner felt Fiona go very still beside him. Porter smiled. "Brave of you," he said, and there was something beneath the word, something light and cruel, the way certain men can be cruel without raising their voice. Tanner looked at him. Then he did something he hadn't planned. He turned to Fiona and said, simply and quietly, directly to her, as if Porter Bellamy did not exist, "You look beautiful tonight. I should have said it at the door." The color rose in her face. She stared at him. Porter's smile stayed on but went still. Tanner met his eyes then, unhurried. "Porter," he said, "congratulations on your brother's wedding." Porter said nothing. He nodded once and moved away. Fiona exhaled. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," Tanner said. He reached for 2 glasses of champagne from a passing tray and handed her one. They stood side by side at the edge of the room, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the music filled the space between them, and Tanner Wilds thought about the last time he had stood in a room like this and felt like himself. It had been a long time. They danced once. Neither of them had planned it. The music had shifted into something slow, and he had simply held out his hand and she had taken it. And then they were moving and it felt easier than it should have, the way some things feel easier than they should. She was precise in her movement, as he might have expected from someone who had spent her life counting time in a different way. He was less graceful and didn't pretend otherwise. "You own Hartwell and Cole," she said. It wasn't a question. "With a partner," he said. "Simon Hartwell. He does the press releases. I do the rest. I've played at 3 of your firm's events," she said. "You were never there." "I was probably in a conference room somewhere apologizing for being late." She almost smiled. "Is that what you do?" "More than I'd like." The song ended. They stepped apart. Across the room, Tanner watched Margot Ellison, now Beaumont, or soon to be, laugh at something her new husband said, her hand on his arm, her whole body turned toward him. He watched her the way you watch something you once loved from a careful distance, measuring what you feel against what you expect to feel. What he felt was quieter than he'd thought. Not nothing, but quieter. He looked back at Fiona, who was watching him. "Someone you cared about," she said. He didn't ask how she knew. "Once," he said. She nodded like she understood the whole sentence in that one word. He drove her home. She hadn't asked him to. He'd simply said he would, and she had been too tired to argue, and maybe, he thought, not entirely sorry. The city was quieter at this hour, the street lights blurring against the damp pavement. She sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window, and didn't fill the silence with noise, which he respected. He found himself thinking about the first time he had heard piano music from the Kessler Building lounge. He had been walking past the door, late, phone in hand, the usual disaster of a Tuesday evening. And something had made him stop, not stop completely, just slow down. A passage of something he didn't know the name of, unhurried and steady, and he had stood there in the hallway for almost a full minute before he caught himself and kept walking. He hadn't known who was playing. He glanced at her now in the pale light of the dashboard. She had her eyes half closed, not asleep, just quiet. There were fine lines of exhaustion around her mouth. Her right hand rested in her lap, and he noticed, without letting himself look directly, that the fingers were slightly curled inward in the way of someone who has learned not to reach for things that cause pain. He pulled up in front of her building. "Thank you," she said. She didn't move immediately. "For tonight. You didn't have to do any of it." "You're welcome," he said. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and there was something careful in her expression, the look of someone deciding how much to trust. "I hope whatever you were looking for in there," she said, "you found some version of it." He thought about Margot laughing by the bar. He thought about the invitation on his desk that morning. He thought about how long he had spent in the last 3 years filling rooms so he wouldn't have to notice how quiet they were. "I think I might have," he said. "Found something." She got out. He watched her reach the door. She didn't look back, but she paused for just a moment at the threshold before she went inside. And he didn't know why, but he sat there in the parked car for another full minute before he pulled away. He started stopping by the Kessler Building lounge on Tuesday evenings. Not every Tuesday. He told himself it was incidental. He had late meetings there twice a month. The coffee was acceptable. The room was quiet enough to think. The first time he stopped and listened, it was for 10 minutes, standing near the door. The second time he sat at a corner table and ordered coffee he didn't drink and listened for half an hour. The third time, she looked up from the keys mid-piece and saw him, and she didn't stop playing, but the corner of her mouth moved. He didn't pretend after that it was incidental. They began talking in the way adults do when they are both too careful to rush. Slowly, by degrees, in fragments that added up over time. She told him about her teacher at conservatory, a formidable woman named Professor Adeyemi, who used to say that music does not forgive self-pity. She told him about the year the dystonia had set in. The denial first, then the specialists, then the slow and brutal understanding that the version of her life she had been working towards since she was 7 years old was not going to be the version she got. "That's what people don't understand," she said one evening, stirring her tea without drinking it. "It wasn't just losing a job. It was losing the language I thought in, the way I made sense of everything." He was quiet. "When did you lose yours?" she said. He looked at her. "What do you mean? The thing you thought in?" She turned the cup in her hands. "You didn't come to that wedding for closure. You went because you were hoping to feel something again. I recognized it because I was there for the same reason." He said nothing for a moment. "Then, the firm became what I thought I was working toward, and when it did, I looked up and there wasn't anyone standing there with me." She nodded. "That's a lonely kind of success," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." One of his firm's charitable initiatives was a mentorship program at a community center in the Garfield district. He had written the initial check 3 years ago, attended the ribbon cutting, made the remarks. He had not been back since. His VP of Corporate Relations sent quarterly updates he read in airport lounges. In January, he went back. It was a Thursday morning, gray and cold, the kind of morning that feels provisional. He walked into the community center and found a volunteer coordinator named Miss Tatum Brierly, a woman of perhaps 60 with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the no-nonsense manner of someone who had seen many well-intentioned executives come and go. She showed him around without ceremony. In the music room there were 12 children between the ages of 8 and 14, seated in folding chairs. At the front of the room, at an upright piano that had seen better decades, sat Fiona Grady. He stopped in the doorway. She was showing a boy of about 10 how to shape his hand over the keys, gently correcting the curl of his fingers, guiding his wrist, saying something quiet that made the boy try again. The sound the boy made was uncertain and slightly off-tempo, and she responded to it with the same patience she might have given to a Carnegie Hall performance. Tanner stood there and watched, and Miss Tatum Brierly said something beside him, and he didn't hear it. He had funded this program. He had signed the papers and approved the budget and moved on to the next line of the balance sheet. He had not known that this was what it looked like. He had not known she was here. After the session, he waited in the hallway. She came out with her coat and a canvas bag and pulled up short when she saw him. "Tanner, you teach here," he said. "I volunteer here," she said. "Thursday mornings. For about 2 years. I didn't know." She studied his face. Something in her expression shifted. "You should have come back sooner," she said, not unkindly. "This is the part that matters." He looked back at the door of the music room, where he could hear the boy still practicing, still trying. "I know," he said. "I'm starting to understand that." He saw her more often after that. It began, as these things do, in the space between coincidence and intention. He found reasons to be in the Garfield district. He began attending the Thursday sessions, initially sitting in the back, then helping where he could, moving equipment, managing sign-in sheets, fixing the third folding chair from the left that had a broken hinge. Small things. Things that had nothing to do with a balance sheet. Fiona watched all of this with a kind of quiet assessment that he found both unsettling and fair. One Thursday in February, a girl of about 11 he'd learned her name from the sign-in sheet, named Roxy, sat down at the piano and froze. She had been practicing a piece for 6 weeks. She knew it, but she sat there and her hands wouldn't move, and her jaw worked like she was trying to find words in a language that had gone quiet. Fiona sat beside her on the bench. She didn't say anything at first. She just waited. Then she played the opening bars herself, slowly, and left the last note hanging. Roxy picked it up, finished the phrase, and then kept going. Tanner watched from the back of the room. He was not a man who cried in public. He had, at various points in his career, sat across from regulators and opposing counsel and shareholders demanding answers, and kept his composure without difficulty. He kept it now, but just barely. Afterward, when the kids had gone, he stood with Fiona in the empty music room. both of them putting chairs back in place, and he said, "How long have you been doing this? The volunteering?" "All of it," he said. "Showing up, staying patient, giving something that costs you." She set a chair down. "Since I had nothing else to give," she said. "That's usually when you figure out what actually matters." He looked at her across the room. The late afternoon light came in through the high windows and fell across the piano and across her, and he thought, not for the first time and not quietly, that she was the most quietly remarkable person he had ever stood in a room with. "Fiona," he said. She looked up. "I'm not pretending anymore," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Whatever this is, I'm not pretending." She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he thought he might have miscalculated. Then she said, "I know. I've known for a while." "And," he said, "and I'm terrified," she said, "in case that's useful for motivations." "It is," he said, "because so am I." March came, and with it a new problem. A columnist for a city magazine, the kind of publication that covered charity galas and real estate transactions and speculated endlessly about which executives were sleeping, which board members, had begun following Tanter's Thursday visits with something approaching intent. He didn't know how it started. These things never started anywhere specific, but by the second week of March there were photos. Tanner Wilds leaving the Garfield Community Center with a woman. Tanner Wilds, who had been famously private since his name went on the building. Tanner Wilds photographed looking at a woman the way a man looks when he has forgotten he is being photographed. The story that ran was not vicious. It was something worse, casually diminishing. It described Fiona as a former concert pianist, which was accurate, and then immediately pivoted to the injury, the career derailment, the reduced circumstances, piano background music in corporate lobbies, community volunteer work, and then, with the kind of elegant cruelty that passes for journalism in certain circles. Sources close to Wilds suggest the relationship may be a phase, the CEO's brief departure from his usual social orbit. Fiona did not call him when it ran. She texted him 2 words, "Saw it." He called her immediately. She didn't pick up. He drove to the Garfield district. She met him at the door of her building, not buzzed him up, met him at the door, which told him everything about how she was feeling. Her expression was controlled in the way that costs something. Her arms were crossed, not defensively, but like she was holding herself together. "You don't have to do this," she said. "Do what?" "Manage this. Issue a statement. Smooth it over." She looked at the street. "I know how it works. A story like that gets 3 days and it disappears. You don't owe me anything." "I'm not here to manage anything," he said. "I'm here because someone said something unkind about you in print, and I wanted to make sure you knew that I disagree." She looked at him. "You are not a phase," he said. "You are not a departure from anything, and anyone who describes you as a woman with a reduced life has not been paying attention." Something shifted in her face. The careful control flickered. "Tanner," she said. "I know it was frightening," he said. "I know it feels like the ground moved, but I'm not going anywhere unless you ask me to. And even then I'm going to push back." She pressed her lips together. Then she laughed, a short, real laugh, the kind that surprised her. "That's a very aggressive thing to say to someone you're supposedly being gentle with," she said. "I'm not gentle," he said. "I'm honest. There's a difference." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she stepped back and held the door open. "Coffee," she said, "since you drove all the way here." He stepped inside. What happened next was not dramatic, because the truest things rarely are. They argued about music. Specifically, whether the later recordings of a certain pianist she admired had lost the urgency of the earlier ones, which she believed passionately, and he contested not because he knew better, but because he liked watching her argue. He sat with her at the piano once while she showed him the passage she'd been trying to rebuild with her right hand, note by careful note, the way someone reassembles something broken, not to make it what it was, but to find out what it could be. He watched her hands. He didn't say anything. After a while she looked up at him, and whatever was in his expression made her look back at her hands and then back at him, and then very quietly say, "Stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" he said. She didn't answer, but she was almost smiling. He showed her, once, the financial reports from the community center program, the actual documents, not the polished summary, and she looked at the numbers and said, "You could triple the music budget for about what it costs to update your lobby furniture." He tripled the budget by the following week, which his CFO found baffling and which he found clarifying. April, a Sunday, early, still cold. Tanner stood in the Kessler building lobby waiting for his driver. He had a conference call in 40 minutes and a flight at noon. He was, by all external measurements, a man in the middle of an ordinary Monday. His phone was in his hand when he heard it. The lounge was not open yet. It was too early. But from somewhere behind the half-drawn curtain came the sound of a piano, not the usual performance-ready, metered sound. Something different, something searching. A phrase attempted, stopped, started again with one note changed. Then again, and again. He walked to the curtain. Fiona sat at the piano in the low Sunday morning light, her back to him. She was working through something he didn't recognize, short fragments, testing, reconsidering. Her right hand moved slowly, more slowly than it should have, but it moved, and the phrase it found, however halting, was beautiful. She stopped. Listened to what she'd played, the way musicians do, hearing the sound of the note in the room after the sound itself has gone. She didn't know he was there. He stood very still. Then she played it again, slightly faster, slightly more certain. Still imperfect, still hers. He thought about a night a long time ago, when he had walked past the Kessler Building lounge and heard something through the open door and slowed down without meaning to. He had not known the name of the piece. He had not known her name. He had kept walking. He had thought about that 30 seconds of hallway music more times than he had admitted to anyone. He thought about it now, about what it means to walk past something once and not be able to set it down, about all the years between that doorway and this morning, about how many things in his life had felt like arriving, and how none of them had felt like this. She played the phrase once more, finished it. "That's new," he said quietly. She startled, turned. Her expression moved through surprise and then settled somewhere softer. "I've been working on it," she said. "It doesn't have a name yet." He walked into the room, sat down in the chair nearest the piano. The same corner table, the same bad angle, the same position he'd been sitting in on Tuesday evenings for months. "Play it again," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the keys. She played. The room was quiet and bright, and outside the Sunday city was just beginning to move, and Tanner Wilde sat still and listened and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He proposed in the music room at the Garfield Community Center. It was a Thursday. The children had gone home. Roxy had played her piece without stopping in the middle for the second week in a row. And Fiona had told her it was beautiful, which it was. And Roxy had rolled her eyes in the way that 12-year-olds do when they're trying very hard not to show you that something has landed. Tanner waited until the room was empty and the last chair was back in place. He reached into his jacket pocket. No elaborate setup, no orchestrated moment. He had thought briefly about doing something grander, a restaurant, a view, a speech. He had thought about it for approximately 30 seconds before understanding that everything about Fiona Grady was about what was real and what was simple and what lasted. "I know what I want," he said. "I've known for a while now. I just needed to be sure I'd become someone worth saying yes to." She looked at him steadily. "You became that," she said, "a long time before you think you did." He opened the box. The ring was simple. She had told him, offhandedly, months ago that she found large stones anxiety-inducing, which he had filed carefully. She looked at it and then at him, and her eyes went bright. "Tanner," she said. "Fiona Grady," he said. "I am not pretending. I haven't been for a long time. And I would like, if you're willing, to stop pretending together. Permanently," she laughed. It was the real one, short, bright, surprised. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger. She turned her hand over and looked at it and then looked at him, and whatever passed between them in that moment was not something he had language for, only the steady recognition that this, right here, this room, this woman, this particular quiet, was what he had been circling toward without knowing it for most of his adult life. They were married 6 months later in the Garfield Community Center. No press, no guest list vetted by a publicist, no photographer hired through a firm that specialized in candid moments. The room was full of people who had watched the center come alive over the years. Volunteers, teachers, the woman from the front desk, who had worked there for 19 years and cried at everything, and 12 children who had been told they were invited to something important, and arrived in their best clothes. Roxy played the processional. She played it slowly, deliberately, and made only one small error that no one but Fiona heard, and Fiona smiled at it like a gift. Tanner watched Fiona walk toward him across that room, and forgot for a moment every large thing he had ever done in his life, because nothing he had built or closed or signed or announced had ever felt as precisely, simply right as the sight of her moving through the afternoon light in the room, where she had spent Thursday mornings giving something of herself to small hands that needed it. He took her hands when she reached him. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. They both laughed because they were nervous, which was real, and because it was funny to be nervous when you were certain, which was also real. The ceremony was short and the vows were their own. He had written his on a Wednesday night at his desk, 11 o'clock, the city dark outside the window, and he had thrown out 4 drafts before the one that felt honest. He spoke it quietly, so only she could hear. "I spent a long time being very good at things that didn't matter," he said, "and I confused that with a life. You showed me the difference, not by telling me anything, just by being someone who already knew." She pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright. "I thought I had lost my language," she said when it was her turn, "the way I understood myself. And then I found out that language can change, that it can hurt and break and go quiet and then come back different. Better, maybe, or at least more true." She looked at him. "You didn't fix anything, but you stayed while I was figuring it out. That's the thing I'll spend the rest of my life being grateful for." The applause that followed was not from a crowd of hundreds, but it was unguarded and warm, the way applause sounds when people aren't performing their appreciation, when they're just glad. A year later, Tanner Wilde sat in the back of the Garfield music room on a Thursday morning and watched his wife sit at the piano beside a girl who couldn't make her hands move. He watched Fiona wait. He watched her play the first few bars. He watched the girl pick it up and find her way into the music, haltingly, and then with more confidence, and then with something he could only call her own. He thought about the hallway in the Kessler building, the 30 seconds he had almost walked past, the music that had followed him out the door without his permission. He thought about all the things in his life that had felt like success and how few of them had felt like this. Like something that would still matter 20 years from now. Like something a child would carry with her, long after the room had emptied, and the folding chairs were stacked against the wall. And the afternoon light had shifted and moved on. Fiona looked up from the piano and found him, the way she had learned to, in whatever room they shared, the way she always seemed to know exactly where he was without looking. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him for a moment, the way people look when they are saying something they've already said 100 times, and plan to say 100 more. He nodded. She turned back to the girl at the piano and guided her through the phrase one more time, patient, unhurried, certain. And Tanner Wilde sat in his folding chair and thought, this is it. This is the thing that was always worth building.